Christmas Eve. Snow drifted past the frosted windows of Boston's most exclusive restaurant, where champagne flowed and laughter echoed from every table. Every table but one. In the corner, a 72-year-old woman sat alone in her wheelchair, her diamond earrings catching the candlelight, her untouched lobster growing cold. Eleanor Whitmore had built a $3 billion empire. Tonight, she couldn't buy a single person to share her meal. Her fingers trembled as she lifted a napkin to her eyes, and that's when the door swung open. Jerome Carter, a single father in a worn coat, stepped inside with snow dusting his shoulders, holding the hand of his 6-year-old daughter Penny in a red Christmas dress 2 sizes too big. The hostess moved to redirect them, but Penny had already frozen mid-step, her eyes locked on the old woman with tears rolling down her cheeks. Before Jerome could stop her, Penny walked straight toward the billionaire's table and asked softly, "Why are you crying, ma'am?" None of them knew that this single moment would change all of their lives forever. The Charles restaurant had been Eleanor Whitmore's Christmas tradition for 43 years. Back when her husband Robert was alive, they would reserve the corner table by the window, the one with the best view of the falling snow. They would order the lobster thermidor, share a bottle of 1978 Chateau Margaux, and watch the families around them celebrate while holding hands beneath the white linen tablecloth. Robert always said that Christmas was not about the gifts under the tree, but about the warmth you could see in someone's eyes when they looked at you. Eleanor never understood what he meant until he was gone. The accident happened on a Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday that became the dividing line of her entire existence. A delivery truck ran a red light on Commonwealth Avenue, and in the span of 3 seconds, Eleanor lost her husband of 39 years and the use of her legs. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive, but lying in that hospital bed with half her body refusing to respond to her commands, Eleanor wondered what kind of luck they were talking about. The physical therapy took 18 months. Learning to navigate the world from a wheelchair took longer. But the hardest part was returning to an empty penthouse where Robert's reading glasses still sat on the nightstand, waiting for him to come home. Tonight, the restaurant hummed with celebration. To her left, a young couple fed each other bites of chocolate mousse, their wedding rings catching the candlelight. To her right, 3 generations of a family clinked glasses and erupted in laughter at a joke Eleanor could not hear. Behind her, a father hoisted his daughter onto his shoulders so she could touch the crystal chandelier, her giggles rising above the soft piano music. Everywhere Eleanor looked, she saw connection. Everywhere she looked, she saw what she had lost. Her son James had not spoken to her in 11 years. The last conversation they had was in this very restaurant, at this very table, when she informed him that she would not be attending his wedding because she had a merger to finalize in Tokyo. He called her heartless. She called him ungrateful for everything she had sacrificed to build the empire that would one day be his inheritance. The words they threw at each other that night left wounds that neither of them knew how to heal. James moved to Seattle with his wife, and Eleanor heard through mutual acquaintances that she had 2 grandchildren she had never met. 2 small humans who shared her blood but not her life. The lobster on her plate had gone cold. The champagne had lost its bubbles. Eleanor raised her napkin and pressed it against her eyes, not caring anymore if anyone saw. She was 72 years old. She had $3 billion in assets, 17 properties across 4 continents, and a foundation that bore her name. But on Christmas Eve, she could not find a single person to share a meal with. The money, the power, the empire she had spent her entire life building, none of it could fill the chair across from her. None of it could bring back the warmth of Robert's hand in hers. None of it could undo the words she had said to her son in this very room. The door swung open, and a gust of cold air swept through the restaurant. Eleanor looked up through blurred vision and saw a man standing in the entrance, snow clinging to the shoulders of his worn wool coat. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor, and his face was flushed from the cold. But what caught Eleanor's attention was not the man himself, it was the small hand he held in his, belonging to a little girl in a red Christmas dress that hung 2 sizes too big on her tiny frame. The girl's sandy brown hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail adorned with a small red ribbon, and her eyes were wide as she took in the crystal chandeliers and the white tablecloths and the elegantly dressed diners who all seemed to turn and stare. The hostess approached them with the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes. Eleanor could not hear what was being said, but she could read the body language, the subtle assessment of the worn coat and the too big dress, the apologetic gestures, the suggestion that perhaps they might be more comfortable elsewhere. The man's shoulders stiffened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a reservation slip, showing it to the hostess with quiet dignity. Eleanor watched as confusion flickered across the hostess's face as she checked her book, as her smile became marginally more genuine. But before the man could be led to his table, the little girl had slipped free of his grasp. Penny Carter had a gift that her father did not fully understand but had learned to trust. She could see things that adults missed, things hidden beneath the surface of smiles and small talk and social convention. Her mother used to call it her superpower, the ability to look at someone and know exactly what they needed, even when they did not know themselves. When Penny's mother was dying in the hospital, she made Penny promise to use her gift to spread kindness wherever she went. "The world has enough people who look away," her mother had whispered. "Be someone who looks closer." So when Penny walked into the fancy restaurant with all its sparkle and shine, her eyes did not linger on the chandeliers or the Christmas tree decorated with what looked like real diamonds. Instead, her gaze swept across the room until it landed on the old woman sitting alone in the corner. The woman was trying to hide behind her napkin, but Penny could see the tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. She could see the empty chair across from her. She could see the untouched food that spoke of an appetite lost to grief. Before her father could stop her, Penny walked straight through the maze of tables, weaving between waiters carrying silver trays and couples lost in conversation. She stopped directly in front of Eleanor's wheelchair and looked up at her with the unfiltered directness that only children possess. "Why are you crying, ma'am?" she asked. Her voice was soft but clear, cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a bell. Eleanor lowered her napkin and found herself staring into a pair of bright eyes filled with genuine concern. "Penny!" Jerome caught up to his daughter, slightly out of breath and acutely aware of every eye in the restaurant turning toward them. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. She didn't mean to intrude. Come on, sweetheart. Leave the lady alone." He reached for Penny's hand, but his daughter remained rooted to the spot. Eleanor looked at the embarrassed father, then back at the child who refused to look away from her tears. Something in that small, stubborn face reminded her of herself at that age before she learned to harden her heart, before she learned that vulnerability was a weakness to be eliminated. "It's quite all right," Eleanor heard herself say. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, rusty from disuse. How long had it been since she had spoken to anyone outside of business meetings and household staff? "I was just remembering someone I lost." Penny nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. She reached into the pocket of her oversized dress and pulled out a piece of paper folded into a small rectangle. It was a handmade Christmas card, decorated with crayon drawings of snowflakes and a crooked star. "I made this for someone special," Penny said, holding it out to Eleanor. "But I think you need it more." Eleanor's hands trembled as she accepted the card. She opened it carefully, and inside, written in a child's uneven handwriting, were 5 words: "No one should be alone." The tears that Eleanor had been trying to suppress broke free. She pressed the card against her chest and wept openly, her shoulders shaking with the force of emotions she had kept locked away for years. She wept for Robert, for James, for all the birthdays and holidays she had missed while chasing deals that seemed so important at the time. She wept for the grandmother she had never been, for the wife she could never be again, for the mother who had failed so completely. Jerome watched in alarm as his daughter's simple gesture reduced one of Boston's most powerful women to tears. He did not recognize Eleanor Whitmore. He had never moved in the circles where her face would be familiar. All he saw was a lonely old woman in a wheelchair who was now sobbing uncontrollably, drawing concerned looks from the other diners. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry if we upset you," he said, placing a protective hand on Penny's shoulder. "We'll leave you be." Eleanor reached out and caught his wrist with surprising strength. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please don't go. I've been sitting at this table alone for 3 hours. Would you and your daughter consider joining me for dinner?" Jerome hesitated. He had brought Penny to the Charles restaurant as a Christmas surprise, using the last of his savings to make a reservation at the place her mother had always dreamed of visiting. Denise used to clip pictures of the restaurant from magazines, describing in vivid detail the dishes she wanted to try, the atmosphere she wanted to experience just once in her life. She never got the chance. The cancer took her before they could afford anything beyond the hospital cafeteria. But here was this elegant stranger offering to share her table, and something in her eyes, a loneliness so profound it was almost visible, made Jerome reconsider his instinct to politely decline. "My name is Eleanor," the woman said as they settled into the chairs across from her, "and I must apologize for my reaction to your daughter's kindness. I'm not usually so emotional." Jerome introduced himself and Penny, noting how the old woman's eyes lingered on his daughter with something approaching wonder. The waiter appeared and offered menus, and Jerome tried not to let the prices make him visibly flinch. A single appetizer here cost more than his weekly grocery budget. Eleanor must have noticed his discomfort because she waved the menus away and ordered for the table with quiet authority. "Trust me," she said with a hint of a smile. "I've been coming here for decades. I know what's good." As the first course arrived, a delicate soup that tasted like nothing Jerome had ever experienced, conversation began to flow. Eleanor asked about Penny's school, her favorite subjects, her dreams for the future. Penny answered each question with the seriousness of a Senate witness, explaining that she wanted to be a doctor like the ones who had tried to save her mama, or maybe a teacher, or maybe someone who made those beautiful wooden toys she saw in shop windows. At the mention of wooden toys, Jerome's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Eleanor caught it. "What about you, Jerome?" she asked. "What do you do?" He took a deep breath and answered with the same words he had spoken to countless potential employers over the past 3 years. "I'm a craftsman, woodworking, restoration, carpentry. I can build or fix just about anything with my hands." He paused, then added with forced lightness, "But what I mostly do these days is pick up odd jobs where I can find them. Times are tough." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her business instincts engaging despite the setting. A craftsman without steady work. In a city full of buildings that are falling apart, that seems like a waste of talent. The main course arrived lobster that practically melted on the tongue, but Eleanor barely touched hers. She was too absorbed in Jerome's story, which he told with a mixture of pride and pain. He had learned his craft from his grandfather, who had learned it from his father, who had spent his whole life in a small New Hampshire town building furniture that families kept for generations. Jerome had spent 15 years perfecting his skills, building a reputation in his community as someone who could restore antique furniture to its original glory, who could look at a damaged piece of history and see what it was meant to be. Then Denise got sick. The medical bills piled up faster than he could pay them. He sold his tools, his workshop, everything he had built. He took out loans that grew interest faster than he could comprehend. And when Denise died anyway, leaving him alone with a 3-year-old daughter and a mountain of debt, Jerome found that his reputation meant nothing to the banks and landlords who demanded payment. He had been working 3 jobs ever since, overnight shifts at a warehouse, weekend gigs as a handyman. Anything that paid and still let him pick Penny up from school. The dream of returning to his craft felt further away than ever. "I applied to every restoration company in Boston," Jerome said, his voice flat with the exhaustion of repeated rejection. "Every one of them said the same thing. I don't have the right degree. I don't have the right connections. I don't fit their company culture." He let out a bitter laugh. "What they mean is I don't have a fancy diploma from some Ivy League school. I learned my trade the old-fashioned way, with my hands, and apparently that's not good enough anymore." Eleanor's expression hardened. She knew exactly what he meant. She had spent 50 years in business, watching talented people get overlooked because they did not fit someone's narrow idea of what success should look like. Penny had been quietly working on something throughout dinner, her small hands folding and creasing her napkin into an origami shape. Now she presented her creation to Eleanor, a paper crane, slightly lopsided but made with obvious care. "My mama taught me how to make these," Penny said. "She said if you make 1,000 cranes, you get a wish. I've made 247, but I give them away to people who look sad, because maybe they need wishes more than I do." Eleanor accepted the crane with the same reverence she might show a priceless artifact. "What are you wishing for, Penny?" she asked softly. The little girl glanced at her father, then back at Eleanor. "I wish for Daddy to build beautiful things again. He used to smile all the time when he was building." That night, after Jerome and Penny had gone home with leftovers and Eleanor's private number scrawled on a linen napkin, Eleanor sat in her penthouse surrounded by the silence she usually tried to fill with television noise. But tonight she did not turn on the screen. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the snow fall over the city she had helped shape, holding Penny's paper crane in one hand and the handmade Christmas card in the other. Something had shifted inside her during that dinner, a tectonic plate of emotion that she had long believed to be permanently frozen. The next morning, Eleanor made a phone call to Margaret Chen, her personal assistant of 23 years. "I need everything you can find on a man named Jerome Carter," she said. "Woodworker, lives in Boston, has a young daughter." Margaret did not ask questions. Within 48 hours, a comprehensive dossier landed on Eleanor's desk. Jerome Carter, age 38, graduated top of his class from a vocational school that no longer existed. 15 years of documented excellence in furniture restoration and custom carpentry. Clients who raved about his attention to detail, his ability to understand exactly what a piece needed without being told. Then came the darker pages. Denise Carter, deceased at 34 from ovarian cancer. Medical bills totaling $473,000, the bulk of which remained unpaid. Collection agencies. Credit scores decimated. Eviction notice served and barely avoided through a last-minute intervention by a local church. And application after application to restoration firms across New England, all of them rejected with variations of the same polite refusal. One company cited lack of formal credentials. Another worried about his non-traditional background. A third simply stated that they had decided to go in a different direction. But what caught Eleanor's attention most was a folder of photographs that Margaret had somehow obtained pictures of Jerome's work from before the medical bills consumed everything. There was a Victorian writing desk he had restored to museum quality, its inlaid wood gleaming like new. A set of handcrafted chairs that looked like they belonged in a catalog. And most striking of all, a series of wooden toys he had made for Penny. A rocking horse with real horsehair mane, a dollhouse with working doors and windows, a music box that played a melody his wife had hummed to their daughter every night. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The love behind each piece was visible in every detail. Eleanor spent the next 3 days thinking. She pulled up records from her own company, Whitmore Properties, a real estate empire that owned some of the oldest and most historically significant buildings in Boston. Many of those buildings were in desperate need of restoration work that was constantly delayed because qualified craftsmen were hard to find and harder to keep. She thought about the apprenticeship programs she had always meant to start, the community initiatives that had fallen by the wayside as profits took priority. She thought about the legacy she would leave behind when she was gone. On the 4th day, Eleanor called Jerome. "I have a business proposition for you," she said. "Not charity. Business. I need someone to head a new division at my company focused on historical preservation and restoration. The pay is competitive. The benefits include full health coverage for you and Penny, and there's an educational fund that will cover her schooling through college." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Eleanor thought the call had dropped. When Jerome finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't accept a position I didn't earn. I won't be anyone's charity case." Eleanor smiled. though Jerome could not see it. She had expected this response, had hoped for it, actually. A man who would jump at a handout was not the kind of man she wanted leading this initiative. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice taking on the steel that had intimidated boardrooms for decades. "I don't give charity. I make investments, and I've spent the past 3 days looking at your work, Jerome. The desk you restored for the Pemberton family is currently appraised at $40,000. The chairs you built for the Boston Historical Society are on permanent display. You don't need my help. What I need is your talent." They met at Eleanor's penthouse the following week. Jerome arrived in his best clothes, a suit jacket that was slightly too big, having been purchased during better times, and a tie that Penny had picked out because it had tiny hammers on it. Eleanor noticed the details with appreciation. Here was a man who took pride in his appearance even when circumstances made it difficult, who let his daughter choose his tie because her joy mattered more than his dignity. She led him through the apartment to her private office, where blueprints covered every surface. Whitmore Properties owns 37 buildings that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, Eleanor began. Most of them are in varying states of neglect because restoration work is expensive, and contractors who actually know what they're doing are rare. I want to change that. I want to create a division dedicated entirely to preserving these buildings, bringing them back to their original glory while adapting them for modern use. She paused, watching Jerome's face as he studied the blueprints. I want you to lead it. Not because of what happened at the restaurant, but because you're the best person for the job. Jerome walked slowly around the room, examining the photographs and plans with a trained eye. His fingers traced the outline of a Beacon Hill townhouse that had been built in 1823, noting the water damage to its cornice, the inappropriate repairs that had been made over the years. "This building," he said quietly. "Whoever worked on it in the 70s had no idea what they were doing. They used the wrong type of wood for the repairs. It's going to rot from the inside out if someone doesn't fix it properly." Eleanor's eyes lit up. "That's exactly why I need you. The contractors I've hired can follow instructions, but they can't see what you just saw in 30 seconds. But Jerome was not finished examining. He moved to another set of blueprints, this one showing a community center in Dorchester that had been boarded up for years. "What about this one?" he asked. Eleanor's expression flickered. "That property is scheduled for demolition. The cost of restoration exceeds its market value." Jerome turned to face her, his eyes suddenly fierce. "Market value? You mean how much money you can make from it?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, that's exactly what I mean. Convince me I'm wrong." What followed was a 2-hour conversation that ranged from construction techniques to community impact to the true meaning of value. Jerome argued that a building's worth could not be measured only in dollars, that the community center in Dorchester had been the heart of its neighborhood for 60 years before neglect closed its doors. Eleanor pushed back, demanding numbers, projections, proof that restoration made financial sense. By the end, they had reached an understanding that surprised them both. Jerome would take the position, but only if he had the authority to pursue projects based on community need as well as profit potential. And Eleanor would provide the resources, but only if Jerome agreed to mentor young people from underserved communities, passing on his skills to a new generation. "There's one more condition," Eleanor said as they shook hands. "I want you to start an apprenticeship program. Find young people who remind you of yourself at that age, talented, hardworking, overlooked. Give them the chance that no one gave you." Jerome's grip tightened on her hand. For a moment, he could not speak. The dream he had buried 3 years ago, the dream of not just practicing his craft but passing it on, suddenly seemed possible again. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you have yourself a deal." The announcement of the new Historical Preservation Division sent shockwaves through Whitmore Properties. Eleanor had built her company on a foundation of calculated risk and careful vetting, and for her to suddenly create an entire department led by an unknown craftsman with no corporate experience seemed completely out of character. The board members requested an emergency meeting. The CFO, a man named Douglas Harrington, who had been positioning himself for years to take over when Eleanor inevitably stepped down, led the charge. "With all due respect, Eleanor," Douglas said, his voice dripping with condescension that had nothing to do with respect. "This Jerome Carter has no advanced degree, no management experience, and no track record in corporate environments. Our shareholders expect us to make decisions based on qualifications, not personal connections." He let the implication hang in the air. Eleanor looked around the room at the faces of her board members, some sympathetic, some skeptical, some openly hostile. She had built this company from nothing, had made every one of them wealthy beyond their expectations, and now they questioned her judgment. "Let me tell you about qualifications," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I've spent the past 2 weeks reviewing our restoration contracts for the past 5 years. Do you know what I found? Delays, cost overruns, work that had to be redone because the contractors we hired, contractors with impressive degrees and sterling resumes, didn't know the difference between white oak and red oak. Meanwhile, Jerome Carter has a documented history of completing projects under budget and ahead of schedule. His work has been featured in architectural journals and displayed in museums." Douglas was not ready to concede. "That's all very well for small projects, but we're talking about a division that will handle millions of dollars in contracts. How do we know he can manage at that scale?" Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The same way we knew you could manage when I promoted you from junior accountant 20 years ago, Douglas. I made a judgment call based on potential. I was right about you. I'm right about Jerome Carter." She turned to address the full board. "Anyone who wants to bet against my judgment is welcome to tender their resignation. Otherwise, this discussion is closed." Jerome's first day at Whitmore Properties was an exercise in endurance. The office whispered as he walked through the halls. Assistants avoided eye contact. Mid-level managers found reasons to be elsewhere when he entered a room. Douglas Harrington made a point of scheduling meetings that conflicted with Jerome's orientation sessions, forcing him to miss crucial introductions. At lunch, Jerome sat alone in the cafeteria, eating a sandwich he had packed at home while tables of employees carefully looked anywhere but at him. But Jerome had faced worse. He had buried his wife while creditors called his phone. He had explained to his daughter why Christmas would be small that year, and the year after, and the year after that. He had swallowed his pride at job interviews where men half his age looked at his calloused hands and his lack of degrees and decided he was not worth their time. So he ate his sandwich, reviewed his project files, and began making a list of the buildings that needed his attention most. He would let his work speak for itself. It always had before. The first project Jerome selected was not the easy choice. The Beacon Hill townhouse would have been a safer start, prestigious location, clear historical value, relatively straightforward restoration needs. Instead, Jerome chose the Dorchester Community Center that Eleanor had marked for demolition. He spent 3 weeks on site, documenting every crack in the foundation, every water stain on the ceiling, every inch of the building that others had written off as beyond saving. Then he presented his findings to the board in a meeting that Douglas Harrington had tried to cancel twice. "This building was constructed in 1922, Jerome began, his voice steady despite the skeptical faces around the table. "It served as a community gathering place for 60 years. Weddings were held here. Children learned to read in these rooms. When the neighborhood fell on hard times, this was where people came to find help and hope." He clicked to the next slide, showing the current state of decay. "What you see here is not just structural damage. It's the result of deliberate neglect. The previous owners allowed this building to deteriorate because they wanted an excuse to tear it down and sell the land to developers." Douglas interrupted with a theatrical sigh. "This is all very touching, Mr. Carter, but the numbers don't lie. Restoration would cost $2.3 million. The property's current value is $800,000. That's a net loss of $1.5 million. Jerome did not flinch. "Mr. Harrington, I appreciate your concern for the bottom line. But let me show you what the numbers really say. He clicked to a new slide, revealing a detailed cost breakdown that made several board members lean forward in their seats. The previous estimates were based on contractors who would have gutted the building and started from scratch. I'm proposing a different approach, targeted restoration that preserves original materials wherever possible, combined with modern infrastructure hidden within the existing framework. My estimate for this approach is $950,000, and I can have it done in 8 months instead of 18. The room was silent. Eleanor watched as Douglas fumbled for a response. Those numbers are optimistic, he finally managed. I'll believe them when I see them. Jerome met his eyes. Then watch. Over the next 8 months, Jerome proved every skeptic wrong. He worked alongside his crew instead of directing from an office, his hands as dirty as anyone's. He found local suppliers who could provide materials at a fraction of the cost that national vendors charged. He recruited 4 apprentices from the neighborhood young people who had been told their whole lives that they would never amount to anything, and taught them skills that would serve them for decades. When unforeseen problems arose, as they always did in restoration work, Jerome found creative solutions that stayed within budget. The community center reopened on a warm September afternoon, 6 weeks ahead of schedule and $200,000 under budget. The neighborhood turned out in force elderly residents who remembered dancing in these halls 50 years ago, young families who had heard stories from their grandparents, children who ran through the restored rooms with joy that could not be contained. Local news covered the event. The mayor gave a speech, and Jerome stood quietly in the corner, watching Penny run her small hands over the wooden banister he had carved himself, a banister featuring the same pattern his grandfather had taught him decades ago. But Jerome's greatest innovation came after the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He announced that the Restoration Division would launch a formal apprenticeship program, offering paid positions to young people from communities that had been overlooked by traditional trade schools and corporate hiring practices. I was lucky enough to learn from my grandfather, Jerome said during his brief speech. Not everyone has that advantage. But talent exists everywhere, and it's time we stopped pretending otherwise. The first cohort of 12 apprentices would start the following month, learning not just carpentry and restoration but also project management and business skills. Eleanor watched Jerome's success from a distance at first, receiving weekly reports that made her more proud with each passing month. But as the seasons changed, so did her health. The doctors used words like progressive and degenerative, and making her comfortable, words that Eleanor understood all too well. Her body was failing in ways that no amount of money could fix. She spent more and more time in her wheelchair, then in her bed, watching the snow fall past her window and thinking about all the time she had wasted chasing things that did not matter. Douglas Harrington saw opportunity in Eleanor's decline. He began making quiet overtures to board members, suggesting that the company needed stronger leadership during this uncertain time. He questioned the Restoration Division's long-term viability. He implied that Eleanor's judgment had been compromised by illness and emotion, and he recommended, in meetings that Eleanor was too weak to attend, that Jerome Carter's position be re-evaluated once the current projects were complete. Jerome learned of these machinations from Margaret Chen, Eleanor's assistant, who had developed a protective loyalty toward both her boss and the man Eleanor had championed. They're planning to shut down the apprenticeship program, Margaret told Jerome during a quiet conversation in the hallway. Douglas says it's not cost-effective. Jerome's jaw tightened. The apprenticeship program had already trained 23 young people, many of whom had gone on to full-time positions within the company or started their own businesses. Calling it not cost-effective was like calling oxygen unnecessary. That evening, Jerome did something he had never done before. He visited Eleanor at her penthouse, bringing Penny with him. They found her sitting by the window in her wheelchair, thinner than he remembered, but with the same sharp eyes that missed nothing. Penny immediately climbed onto the footrest of Eleanor's wheelchair and began telling her about school, about the crane she had made that day, about how her daddy had let her help sand a piece of wood at the workshop. Eleanor listened with a smile that transformed her face, erasing years of worry and loneliness. I hear Douglas is making moves. Eleanor said after Penny had fallen asleep on the couch. Jerome nodded. I'm not worried about myself. I've survived worse than corporate politics. But the apprentices... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, her grip weak but determined. Jerome, I've spent my entire life fighting battles like this. I'm too tired to fight another one. But you're not. She paused, gathering strength. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have done months ago. What followed was a confession that Eleanor had been carrying for years. She told Jerome about James, about the Christmas dinner where she had chosen work over family, about the 11 years of silence that followed. She told him about the grandchildren she had never met, the birthdays she had missed, the pride that had prevented her from picking up the phone and simply saying she was sorry. I thought I had all the time in the world, she said, tears streaming down her face. I thought there would always be another chance to make things right. And now... Jerome squeezed her hand. It's not too late, he said. It's never too late. The next morning, with Jerome and Penny by her side, Eleanor made a phone call she had been dreading for over a decade. James answered on the fourth ring, his voice guarded but not hostile. The conversation that followed was halting and painful and full of silences that stretched like chasms. But it was a start. James agreed to visit Boston the following month, to bring his wife and children to meet the grandmother they had never known. When Eleanor ended the call, she looked at Jerome with something approaching peace. Thank you, she said, for reminding me what really matters. The grand opening of the Whitmore Center for Historical Preservation took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after that fateful Christmas Eve when a lonely billionaire and a struggling single father first crossed paths. The building, a beautifully restored warehouse in the Seaport district, housed not just offices but also workshops, classrooms, and exhibition spaces showcasing the best of Boston's architectural heritage. Politicians and business leaders mingled with craftsmen and apprentices, all gathered to celebrate what had become the most talked-about initiative in the city's recent history. Jerome stood at the podium, looking out at a crowd that included his apprentices, his colleagues, and the community members who had supported him when no one else would. Penny sat in the front row next to Eleanor, who had insisted on attending despite her doctor's concerns. Beside Eleanor sat James, his wife, and 2 children who called Eleanor Grandma with increasing ease. The family that had been broken was slowly being mended, one conversation at a time, one holiday at a time. When I came to Boston 15 years ago, Jerome began, I had a dream of building something that would last, something that would still be standing long after I was gone. He paused, looking at Penny, then at Eleanor, then at the rows of young faces who had found in this program a chance they thought they would never receive. I thought that meant buildings. I was wrong. The things that last aren't made of wood and stone. They're made of moments, moments of kindness, moments of courage, moments when someone decides to see potential instead of limitations. He told the story of Christmas Eve, of walking into a restaurant where he felt out of place, of his daughter's stubborn refusal to look away from someone else's pain. He spoke of Eleanor's choice to take a chance on a stranger, to bet her reputation on his ability when no one else would. He acknowledged the obstacles they had faced together, the skepticism, the elitism, the quiet sabotage that had followed him through every corporate corridor. There are still people in this company who think I don't belong here, he said, and a ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. They're probably right. I don't belong in their version of this company. But this company is changing, whether they like it or not. The apprenticeship program had now trained over 50 young people, a third of whom had been hired full-time by Whitmore Properties. The restoration division had completed 12 major projects, all on time and under budget, revitalizing neighborhoods that had been neglected for decades. More importantly, Jerome had proven that doing good and doing well were not mutually exclusive, that investing in people and communities could generate returns that went far beyond the quarterly profit report. After the speeches and the ribbon-cutting and the tours of the new facility, Eleanor asked Jerome and Penny to stay behind. The building had emptied out, leaving just the 3 of them in the main exhibition hall, surrounded by photographs of the city they were working to preserve. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a document that Jerome recognized immediately: the papers for the Dorchester Community Center. "I'm transferring ownership of this building to the community," Eleanor said. "It belongs to them. It always did. I'm just correcting a mistake." Jerome took the papers with hands that trembled slightly. He thought of his grandfather, who had spent his life building furniture in a small New Hampshire workshop. He thought of his father, who had passed down those skills despite working 2 jobs to make ends meet. He thought of Denise, who had believed in him when he stopped believing in himself. And he thought of Penny, who would grow up knowing that kindness was not weakness, that compassion could move mountains, that a single moment of human connection could change the course of multiple lives. Christmas arrived again, but this year the scene at Eleanor's penthouse looked nothing like the lonely dinners of years past. The apartment was filled with noise and laughter and the chaos of children running between rooms. James and his family had flown in from Seattle. Jerome and Penny had become fixtures at Eleanor's table, their presence now as natural as breathing. The apprentices from the program had been invited for Christmas Eve dinner, transforming the once silent penthouse into a celebration that spilled from room to room. Eleanor sat in her wheelchair by the window, watching the snow fall over the city she had helped shape. Her health had stabilized, the doctors cautiously optimistic about the months ahead. But even if tomorrow brought bad news, Eleanor knew she would face it differently than she had faced anything in her previous 72 years. She was no longer alone. She had a family, not just the one she had been born into, but the one she had chosen, and the one that had chosen her. Penny appeared at her elbow, holding another paper crane. She had made thousands of them by now, given away to strangers and friends alike, each one carrying the same message of hope that she had offered to a crying old woman 1 year ago. "This one's for you, Grandma Eleanor," Penny said, placing the crane in Eleanor's lap. "Daddy says you're the reason everything good happened to us." Eleanor pulled the child close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the small heart beating against her own. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're the reason everything good happened to me." Outside, the snow continued to fall on Boston, covering the streets and the buildings and the community center in Dorchester that had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose connection over isolation. Inside, Jerome raised a glass to toast the season, surrounded by faces that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be more obstacles, more skeptics, more moments when giving up seemed like the rational choice. But none of them would face those challenges alone. And in the corner of the room, on a small table that Jerome had built with his own hands, sat a handmade Christmas card decorated with crayon snowflakes and a crooked star. 5 words, written in a child's uneven handwriting, had started everything. No one should be alone. Those words had brought a billionaire back to her family. They had given a struggling father a second chance. They had reminded everyone who read them that the truest measure of a life was not what you accumulated, but what you gave away. As the clock struck midnight and Christmas Day began, Eleanor looked around at the people who had become her family, and for the first time in years, she felt no need to wipe away her tears. They were tears of joy. They were tears of gratitude. They were tears of a woman who had finally learned what her husband had been trying to tell her all those years ago, that Christmas was not about the gifts under the tree, but about the warmth you could see in someone's eyes when they looked at you. And tonight, everywhere Eleanor looked, she saw warmth.